It's also my pleasure to serve as the chair of this grand final. Welcome to the final round of the World Schools Debating Championship 2008. The topic for this debate is, this House would expand the permanent membership of the United Nations Security Council. Each speaker will have 8 minutes to present a constructive speech, and either the first or second speaker for each team will present a 4-minute reply speech. After the first minute, a bell will sound, and points of information may be offered. After the 7th minute, a bell will sound, and no further points of information may be offered. The bell will ring 2 times at the end of the 8th minute. The bell will ring once after 3 minutes of the reply speech and twice after 4 minutes. There are no points of information during the reply speeches. There is no verbal interaction between the audience and the debaters during the debate. At the end of the debate, the judges will leave their completed ballots with me and leave the room to discuss their decision. They will return to the room, and one of them will give a brief explanation about the debate. The proposition in this round is the team from New Zealand. The first proposition speaker is Ms. Jen Savage. The second proposition speaker is Mr. Ben Kornfeld. The third proposition speaker is Ms. Maria English. The reply speech will be given by Mr. Ben Kornfeld. The opposition in this round is the team from England. The first opposition speaker is Mr. Ben Woolgar. The second opposition speaker is Mr. Seb Farquhar. The third opposition speaker is Mr. James Fox. The reply speech will be given by Mr. Ben Woolgar. It is now my pleasure to introduce the grand final adjudicators for this debate. From Singapore, Mr. Aaron Maniam. From Australia, Mr. Christopher Erskine. From Canada, Ms. Janet Webster. From Romania, Simona Mazilu. From Wales, Ms. Beth James. From Slovenia, Liana Maholic. From Pakistan, Timer Bandi. From Slovakia, Branislav Fečko. And from the Republic of Korea, Jumin Lee. And now, I would like to introduce the first speaker for the proposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, we say that a global problem demands a global solution. And this is the problem with the current United Nations Security Council. There is currently underrepresentation and unfair representation of global power, which accrues the concrete harms of mismanagement of security issues or willful ignorance about security issues. And Team New Zealand thinks it is no longer acceptable that security issues get sidelined just because they don't affect Western Europe. And it will be the case of Team New Zealand today that expanding the permanent membership on the UN Security Council expands the range of issues the Council deals with, makes that organisation more effective, more legitimate and more relevant, and improves the international security situation. New Zealand says it's high time the UN got a bigger table. So in terms of both a definition and a model, what we propose is simple. We propose adding 5 countries to the Security Council. These 5 nations are Japan, India, Brazil, Nigeria, and Egypt. And they would have the veto power along with the 5 existing members of China, Russia, France, the US, and the UK, who would also retain their seats. And we note that France have offered to share their permanent seat with Germany, which we would also encourage. We would also expand the number of non-permanent members in proportion to permanent members. So we would add 10, bringing the total to 20. And the powers of the organisation, well, they would remain the same, according to chapters 6 and 7 of the Charter, which is that the Security Council investigates any situation threatening to international peace, recommends procedure for peaceful resolution of dispute, and enforces its decisions militarily, no thank you, or any other way. And New Zealand will be proving to you why we should expand permanent membership in 5 substantive points. First, that the Security Council should be reflective of today's balance of power, making it more relevant and more legitimate. Second, that the new permanent members would ensure a wider range of issues get discussed. And third, that new perspectives would foster more effective outcome resolutions. And then my second speaker, Ben, will be looking at how new members will improve the use of the veto, ensuring better cooperation between members, and that our model broadens the Security Council's focus to concentrate on peaceful leadership as opposed to just military might. And so now to this first substantive. And we say first that the Council should be a reflection of real world power. And these new members of India, Brazil, Japan, Nigeria and Egypt would be a reflection of contemporary security interests today. When the P5, the permanent 5, were established, it was because they had won a war and Britain still had an empire. But ladies and gentlemen, the sun has well and truly set on that empire. I'll take you in a moment. And although the countries are still important, we say they're no longer the whole war game, sir.
So how do you respond to the fact that Nigeria has consistently misused its military power and intervention so far, and that Egypt, for example, is a profoundly unstable and undemocratic country?
What we in fact see in Nigeria is when the US and the UN stood by not knowing what to do in Sierra Leone and in Liberia, they stood around doing nothing. And what Nigeria did, ladies and gentlemen, was didn't act in self-interest and instead took its own troops into there and propped them up single-handedly for months, ladies and gentlemen. So that's a fairly simple response. But to return to this idea, the second reason we say that the Security Council should reflect power is that members of the UN and the world in general are very different places. It makes no sense that 3 Western powers can dictate the agenda of a council that should be spending its time working on problems in developing nations as well. We say that adding permanent members from Africa, from Latin America and from Asia is necessary to give credence to an organisation that claims to be speaking on behalf of the world.
Madam.
We think, no thank you, that it's very important that all regions have a real voice, and a real voice from someone who deserves it and who can do it, like Japan, who Japan single-handedly contributes more economically and in terms of aid than France, than China, and the US combined, ladies and gentlemen, no thank you. Japan funds the UN primarily, and so also should be in a power position. Or like India, who's the largest democratic nation, is an emerging economic power, and is a large contributor of peacekeepers. We say these additional members actually balance, no thank you, and mirror the power and the real world today. And this brings me to my second substantive, about how expanded permanent membership ensures a wider range of interests are discussed. Now, it's clear at the moment that issues given prominence or largely discussed are issues which interest the P5, and this is true logically, but also empirically true, and would point you to the 1990s when genocide occurred. Well, genocide in Europe, the Balkans Wars, got no lack of attention or assistance from the Security Council because it affected them. But no thank you, what happened in Africa is they were able to sideline it and ignore it, and white lives were prioritised over black lives, and that is disgusting. No thank you, the Security Council was able to sideline the Rwandan genocide because nobody on the council was in a position to advocate for Africans and for Africa, and in a position to demand, I'll take you in a moment, to demand power like people like Nigeria could under our proposal.
Rwanda wasn't sidelined, it was vetoed, and that problem's going to be bigger under your system with twice as many vetoes.
No, ladies and gentlemen, because the problem would be brought to the front. What happens when you have 5 people in the gentleman's club who smoke cigars out back? They can sideline it on the quiet. When you've got Nigeria with a veto as well, along with 4 other people with a veto, they're going to demand some action, and they're in a power to demand some action. So what we see is that issues, in fact, don't get sidelined, as they do now. So by making the Security Council more representative and diverse, it brings in equal power and equal chance of making the difference. And this brings me to my third substantive, about how this will foster better decision-making for the Council. And we say that with these new members comes the power to create new solutions in 2 ways. Firstly, because you've got these new perspectives on the Council, you have perspectives that can solve areas in different regions. And I've already pointed you to when this happened in Nigeria. And the second reason this will happen is because you've got more people on the Council with a vested interest in making a difference. So they'll be incentivized to get the best approach because it matters to them. As we didn't see in Rwanda, when 5 non-African countries eventually sent a mere 4,000 troops to a place where 2.4 million people were fighting. Under our model, the perspective would be there and the incentives would be there. Ladies and gentlemen, we give you better representation, we give you more issues, and we give you discussion, and we give you better solutions. The maintenance of international security demands international response. We propose.
Speech lasted 8 minutes and 2 seconds.
Thank you, Ms. Savage. I would like to now introduce the first speaker for the opposition.
No one denies that the United Nations has problems and that sometimes it makes mistakes. But on side opposition today, we can't imagine why the solution to that is to exacerbate the one problem that is the principal cause of those mistakes, namely the Permanent Members Security Council veto. because the boys from England are here today to tell you that bigger isn't always better. Now, we're coming to you under the team line that we're prepared to tolerate necessary evil, but we're not prepared to tolerate unnecessary evil. And that's what side proposition's case amounts to today, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to look at that under two headings. I'm going to look at why permanent membership isn't evil, why it's a problem, and why extending it will be so damaging. And then secondly, I'm going to look at why we only tolerate necessary evils, and why the P5 are in fact a necessary evil. No, thank you. Seb's going to look then at the evils of selection, the problems of adding these members in 2008. But before I move on to my substantive case, let's have a look at the three things we were told, no thank you, madam, out of first problem. Now, first of all, they said, the Security Council needs to reflect real-world power. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, which is exactly why, no thank you, madam, the 5 states who get permanent seats should be the world's 5 most powerful countries. And I'll look at that, thanks, madam, a little bit later in my speech. We say actually they are the 5 principal power brokers in the world. Then within this, they said, well, the P5, the permanent membership should reflect the developing world. We think there's a bit of a problem here, ladies and gentlemen, that the 5 countries they've selected aren't going to reflect the developing world at all. Because what nations do when they get on the Security Council is they operate in their own self-interest, ladies and gentlemen. And this is absolutely vital. No, thank you, sir. We don't think that the majority of Latin America sees its foreign policy interests aligned with Brazil. In fact, we think Venezuela and Bolivia see them aligned exactly the other way, ladies and gentlemen. Similarly, we don't think Pakistan is going to be very happy about India pursuing individual interests on the SC. No, thank you, madam. And they said, well, it's a Western body. Well, no, it's clearly not, because it's got China and Russia, who are very clearly not Western states. Then they said, issues get sidelined. And this was all their stuff about, well, we ignored genocide in Africa. So that's not true at all, ladies and gentlemen. Bureaucratic dithering at the United Nations is a problem, and it's a problem that results principally from the veto system. No thanks, madam, which they want to expand. Intervention in Rwanda wasn't sidelined, it was vetoed. And equally, ladies and gentlemen, there were problems with the intervention in southeastern Europe, in Srebrenica, not because people weren't represented, but because the UN has structural flaws. Yes?
Japan is a Pacific power broker and contributes 4 times more money to the UN than your country.
Thanks, madam.
Why should your country have a seat?
The job of the P5 is to uphold security. Japan cannot send its military forces abroad. We don't think it's very useful at upholding security. And lastly, they talked about better decision-making, which once again, we say is an issue of self-interest, not global interest, ladies and gentlemen. Nigeria is not going to be bound to act on behalf of Africa under their model. But now let's talk about why permanent membership isn't evil. First of all, we say it is principally wrong, we think, to elevate one group of states over another group of states in terms of power. We don't think it is right that we should give those countries dominance. So we say, why do more? No, thank you, sir. We say, why add yet more states to that unfair position of dominance? And especially, why do it now? We acknowledge that essentially the P5 are there because they won a world war. We don't think that makes them bad at their job. We think historical accidents can be good. I think I'm quite a good example of how an accident can lead to greatness. But we'd say, actually, the United Nations has achieved plenty of successes in the Iran-Iraq War, no thank you, in the First Gulf War, ushering in democracy in East Timor, in Kosovo. And those are all things, ladies and gentlemen, that their proposition would undermine and would potentially deny. Why? Well, ladies and gentlemen, because of the veto. Because we say once members get on the council, they do pursue their own self-interest. They block things they think will harm them, which is why it's hard for the council at the moment to intervene in Zimbabwe because of a Chinese veto. We see no reason to make the problem worse by adding a whole load more. Twice as many member states, no thank you madam, twice as many permanent members means twice as many potential vetoes, and therefore loads more inaction, ladies and gentlemen. a whole load more issues that won't get dealt with. No thanks. Here we look at the example of Brazil and India's opposition to the current United Nations intervention in Sudan. Now, they delayed this, they refused to contribute troops, and they tried to obfuscate it from happening diplomatically. They want to give them a seat on the council so that they can veto it outright. Moreover, ladies and gentlemen, we say even if you don't veto directly, stuff takes longer. There are more people to pork barrels bribe with spending. No thanks, madam. And when people are dying in conflict, wasting time equals wasting lives. Their proposition is one which undermines the United Nations' principal function of preventing conflict. Yes, sir.
Raising countries in the United Nations to a higher level than others is not unfair. It is a representation of the reality of this world.
Okay, sir, why is it a representation of the reality of this world to raise Brazil above the rest of Latin America, which has completely different priorities? No thank you. We say we only tolerate, now onto this idea that we only tolerate necessary evil. Because why do we give 5 countries this awful, this abhorrent power that side opposition think is so harmful? Well, for a pretty good reason, actually. Namely, that it prevents World War III. Because the P5 are states with spheres of influence that they're going to seek to protect. If the UN had decided to intervene in Georgia, ladies and gentlemen, no thanks, madam, we think Russia would have gone to war with it. The reason we have a veto in the first place is so that we would get that veto in the boardroom rather than on the battlefield, so that people don't die. Now, why these 5 states specifically? The answer, ladies and gentlemen, is in power projection, because these states' power threatens the whole of the world's security. First of all, by sea. They're the only states with blue water navies, with aircraft carriers, with international naval bases, who can therefore fight conflicts wherever they choose, as the US and the UK were able to do in Iraq. We also see over land that they are the states most capable of projecting their power beyond their own region, because they have big transport planes and self-contained arms industries, crucially, ladies and gentlemen. That doesn't apply to Japan, which can't send its forces outside of its own borders by its constitution. It doesn't apply to Brazil or India, which don't have this technology. It doesn't apply to Nigeria or Egypt. It doesn't apply to any of their examples. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, because those spheres of influence are so vital, but these new countries don't have them, so it's not necessary to give them that membership, we beg to oppose.
Speech lasted 8 minutes and 10 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Woolgar. I would now like to introduce the second speaker for the proposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, enough is enough. We need to change the United Nations Security Council, and we are proud that our proposition solves many of the problems it is faced with today. We make the Security Council more relevant, we make them create better decisions, and we make them decide more rapidly on the important issues. I'm going to extend this case of side proposition by showing you how our model improves the use of the veto, unlike what side opposition would suggest, and furthermore brings a wider repertoire of approaches to the Security Council. But first, I'd like to take a look at what's already happened in today's debate. Because Jen brought out 3 very clear substantive points for you. Firstly, that there would be more representative. Secondly, that there will be more issues brought to the Council. And finally, that they'll make better decisions. And the opposition did not adequately respond to these. In response to it being more representative, they are stuck in the colonial past where the 5 nations on the P5 at the moment were the most powerful. Well, ladies and gentlemen, they are not anymore. India has more nuclear weapons than Britain and France combined. It also provides the most peacekeepers. No thank you. Japan is the world's 2nd largest economy and a huge power broker. They are stuck out of reality, and reality is what the permanent members need to represent. No thank you. Furthermore, they didn't engage with the deep analysis Jen provided, showing why there would be more issues brought up and better decisions, because instead it was only in self-interest. But they never showed us why it isn't in these nations' self-interest to deal with conflicts and crises in their backyard, which was the very analysis Jen brought up for you, and something that they never showed you wouldn't be true under our model. No thank you. They then brought up 2 substantive points of their own. Firstly, about how the veto would become worse, and secondly, about how it was unfair. I'm going to deal with both of these. With regards to how the veto will become worse, we have 4 responses. Firstly, they made the assertion that more nations equals more vetoes being used. That is empirically untrue. Certain nations, like the United States, which makes 80% of all vetoes, simply veto more. And the nations which we are adding have shown a huge propensity to be cooperative, to negotiate, and to come to good decisions. No thank you. Secondly, we say that if they want to have anything done, which is in their interests, they do need to cooperate, and our model forces them to do so. Thirdly, we say it brings things to the table faster, so they have to make decisions on them in public and cannot merely use the threat of the veto behind closed doors. And finally, we say that they have done their analysis on the basis that the incentives for every nation stay the same. But in my substantive material, I'm going to show you exactly how we provide incentives for them to be much less selfish. Thus, we can see that the veto is not an issue. And secondly, with this argument they brought up as to how it's unfair to elevate nations, we say, ladies and gentlemen, where is the basis of their argument that the Security Council is meant to be fair? Its role is to maintain peace and security throughout the world, ladies and gentlemen, and that's why we have the permanent members. No thank you. This is not unfair. This is the representation of the real world, which is something that the UN needs to do, because no matter how much they deny it, India does have nuclear weapons. Egypt, no thank you, is supported by the Arab world. Nigeria has 46 million people and huge amounts of oil. No thank you. Japan is the world's 2nd largest economy with huge amounts of troops. And we can see that these are very powerful nations who can perform a vital role in ensuring peace and security, no thank you, even if it isn't directly through war. And that's going to be another benefit that I'll show in my case, that we can solve these problems without resorting directly to war. And now that I've dealt with their case, let's have a look at 2 additional benefits of what we propose. Now, my first substantive point is that the addition of members to the Permanent Security Council leads to more responsible use of the veto. And it does this in 2 ways. Firstly, it introduces a cost to using the veto that doesn't exist under the status quo. Because at the moment, the Permanent 5 can use the veto with impunity for their own self-interest, and the rest of the Permanent 5 let them do so. However, when we introduce a more diverse group with a veto, it inevitably will have an effect on another permanent member when one permanent member uses that veto. No thank you. And since cooperation, which every other member is required in the long term for this progress, which everyone wants, they're going to have to cooperate. And it's in their incentives not to annoy the other members and to cooperate when it is required. Is this not the case, sir?
If cooperation is so hard with 5 nations, explain why more diversity and more difference in interest makes it easier with 10.
Well, I just did, because when you make a veto under our model, ladies and gentlemen, you're going to negatively harm at least one of the members in that group, which means they won't want to cooperate with you when you want to have a resolution passed. That is opposed to right now, where often the 5 members have common interests. And because of that, people are forced to cooperate. For instance, under the status quo, yes, Russia and China often veto intervention in places like Zimbabwe because they fear the precedent it sets in places like Tibet and Chechnya and Taiwan. But under our model, no thank you, they will need Nigeria's support for cooperation on their resolutions in the future. And they can only get this if they provide Nigeria with support for Nigeria's aims in Zimbabwe. Now, the second way in which we improve the use of the veto is we make it more transparent by reducing the threat of the veto being used to keep things off the table. Because under the status quo, the Permanent Five avoids dealing with issues publicly because often it is in the interest of all of them to keep them secret and deal with it in the back room. However, no thank you. When we add 5 more members, it will always be in one of those members' interests to have this in the public arena. That means nations will be reluctant to publicly veto something which is forced onto the agenda because it makes it look like they're tacitly condoning it. And furthermore, when they do veto it, it can be publicly seen and pressure applied. No thank you. For instance, in 1994, Rwanda was not vetoed. Rwanda was forced never to come to the table by France because they did this through backroom negotiations. However, as soon as it was able to be brought to the table, France agreed because they knew it would look so bad if they tacitly condoned genocide However, under our model, Nigeria would have forced it to the table earlier, and so a resolution would have been made earlier. Now, my second substantive point is how this diversifies the international security paradigm beyond the simplistic issue of military strength. Because at the moment, all the members of the Permanent Five are there because of their military strength only. That makes the focus of the Council only on military conflict and only on using military force to solve threats. However, in implementing this model, we introduce a more diverse range of interests, which will broaden the issues treated as security threats to include causes of destabilization, like poverty, like AIDS, and like desertification, which affect Nigeria and Brazil. And additionally, by including groups which have had success in dealing with security threats through things like multilateral organizations and also through aid, we will increase the tools they have to deal with these issues without military strength. So, ladies and gentlemen, because we help the veto, not hinder it, because we help the UN Security Council carry out its job, the motion stands.
The speech lasted 8 minutes and 10 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Kornfeld. I would now like to introduce the second speaker for the opposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, yesterday after the debate, I was pretty hungry. So I went down to the store and I bought some pretty questionable hot dogs, which I then chowed down on 5 of them. Afterwards, I felt really sick. Now, it's a shame New Zealand wasn't there to help me out, because I know they had the killer solution. Buy another 5, eat another 5, and it will solve all your problems. And we think that that is an enormous problem with the proposition case today, because while we tolerate necessary evil, we will not tolerate unnecessary evil. Now, Ben talked about why the Permanent Security Council is evil and all of the problems associated with it. And the proposition agreed with us on a lot of these problems. And then he went on to explain why we tolerate these P5, these Permanent 5 members, because they're necessary, because they're special. And they engage a little bit more with that, and I'm going to talk about that in a few seconds. And then I'm going to move on to the evils of selection and why picking people out from the crowd in and of itself creates problems. So, no, thank you, ma'am. One of their points was that Japan should be allowed onto the Security Council permanently. India should be allowed on because they contributed on, ladies and gentlemen. Now, we don't think it's right that people should be able to buy their way into the Permanent Security Council because they contributed on. We just think that doesn't stand. Then they had this point, which they came back to, no thank you, ma'am, about bringing new material to the table, because these new permanent members will be able to bring new material to the table. First off, no thank you, ma'am. We think that's what non-permanent members are for to a large extent, because they've totally ignored the presence and role of non-permanent members in bringing issues to the table, and haven't shown why a permanent member is more able to bring issues to the table than a non-permanent member. No thank you, ma'am. And further, because we think that their examples just didn't stand in practice. And then there was this issue of representativeness, ma'am. And they've put forward some countries which they claim are representative. They said Egypt represents the Arab world.
Point of
Egypt doesn't
information.
represent the Arab world. Most of the Arab world, no thank you, doesn't trust Egypt at all. If they want someone you can trust, what about Saudi Arabia? Or someone who the Arab world actually gets behind? No thank you, sir. And then they came up with these ideas of places like Japan, which is prevented in its constitution from actually engaging and is therefore useless. Brazil, which doesn't align with the power bloc of South America at all. Nigeria, which certainly can't represent all of Africa because of ethnic issues and because of the fact that they can't have the entire continent as their backyard. Matt.
Under the status quo of willful blindness and the backroom five, Rwanda was created. Is that okay with you?
Now, firstly, we don't think Rwanda would have been solved any better under your model because we think that France would still have had a veto and you're not getting rid of that. Second off, we think that the issue was about vetoes and that vetoes are a problem which is exacerbated under your system, and that's my next point of rebuttal. They made this assertion, this analysis, that because it would be so dangerous if anyone ever used a veto, and if anyone ever used a veto, everyone else would start using a veto, that no one will ever use a veto. Well, ladies and gentlemen, firstly, we think that there are actually two options if a veto has such a powerfully negative impact on everyone else. One, everyone uses vetoes all the time, and we think that's the option they ignore. No, thank you, ma'am. Or two, people never use vetoes, and we think that that's equally dangerous because we think that the veto system is there for a reason, as Ben explained in his point about necessary evil. And so we think that actually their analysis didn't clearly show why everyone would stop using a veto if all of a sudden a veto might hurt someone else. Because an American veto might hurt Russia, but that doesn't mean that America stops using its veto. So we think that analysis doesn't stand. No, thank you, ma'am. And lastly, they had this point about broadening issues from military force for the Security Council. Well, let me tell you something. First off, the Security Council already has a range of sanctions at its fingertips. No, thank you, sir. Which they use. Secondly, this idea that the Security Council should get involved with AIDS and the like is ridiculous. That's what the World Health Organization is for. That's not what the Security Council is for, ladies and gentlemen. The Security Council is for security, and that's what it does, and that involves, to a large part, military affairs, and we think that's completely normal and to be expected. Yes, ma'am.
Can you please explain why Britain is going to do a better job of representing Africa than Nigeria, an African nation, would?
Ma'am. First off, we think representation is not what the Security Council is fundamentally about. The Security Council is fundamentally about world security, and that isn't necessarily derived from representation alone, and you need to show us why it is. And secondly, we think that in fact, the interests we need to be most interested in are those which, when violated, will lead to global war. And we think that that's why we've chosen the permanent five, and you haven't engaged properly with our material there. No, thank you, sir. So now I'm going to talk about the balance of power, ladies and gentlemen, because we think that the balance of power in the status quo is fundamentally important, no thank you, and that shifting the balance of power arbitrarily by raising certain powers into the ether under your measure just shifts the balance of power in a fundamentally dangerous way, ladies and gentlemen. Because if you're allowed the veto, you have the power to protect your friends from the UN and to make sure that your enemies don't get any protection from the UN. And we think that's really dangerous. And we look at, for example, India and Pakistan's relationships, no thank you. And we think that if India were on the UN Security Council, Pakistan would not feel that it had a neutral broker in order to come to terms with India, in order to try to settle issues in Kashmir. Instead, it would feel surrounded. It would become paranoid that it had no one to turn to. No, thank you, ma'am. Because whatever you say, India doesn't represent Pakistan's interests. And we think that what this would mean is a Pakistan which has more military posturing, a Pakistan which becomes more jingoist, and we think that this is just an example of the kind of problems which result from a shift in power. No, thank you, sir. And we think that the Security Council should be about promoting security. It should be about finishing tensions which exist, in solving issues which exist. And the one thing it absolutely shouldn't do is create new tensions by changing the way it's set up. And we think that that is exactly what you're doing. No, thank you, ma'am. And now, on to another problem with selecting people for the Security Council. No, thank you, sir. And this is the legitimacy of the Security Council. Because we feel that the legitimacy of the Security Council rests on both the necessity of the presence of those members, no thank you, ma'am, and Ben has outlined why these powers are especially necessary, especially important with his analysis about the projection of power which he has fully addressed. And further, it's also also rest on their effectiveness and their ability to fulfill their responsibility to protect, ladies and gentlemen. No, thank you. Because we think since 2006, the P5 has been entrusted with the responsibility to protect others, ladies and gentlemen. And this has become one of the key duties of the permanent members of the Security Council. And we think that their new suggestions are fundamentally unable to fulfill this responsibility to protect. Japan, for example, because it constitutionally can't, and the rest of them because they militarily haven't got the power. And we think that both undermines the meaning of a responsibility to protect for everyone involved, and undermines the legitimacy of the Security Council in being a permanent body designed to protect everyone, ladies and gentlemen. So we on the opposition think that the proposition has made some mistakes. We think that they've asserted that it will be more representative. We think that's false. They have also asserted that an increase in representativeness translates to an increase in security. And we think that that's false. So ladies and gentlemen, because it's a necessary evil and we don't want to push it into an unnecessary evil, we beg to oppose.
The speech lasted 8 minutes and 4 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Farquhar. I would now like to introduce the third proposition speaker.
Ladies and gentlemen, today we have an opposition who say that the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council are a necessary evil. They've told us that they think permanent membership is bad, and they've told us they think the veto power is bad. And yet they say that we should keep this power focused in the hands of 5 nations. So we say it is up to them to show us that it is necessary that it be contained within these nations. And they have to show us that the many benefits we've pointed to of sharing that power and spreading the interests and getting more perspectives and more representation leads to a better Security Council. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at this debate in 2 key areas. The first key area is, what is the Security Council's role, and do we need representation to achieve that? And my second area is going to be, what is the effect of this model going to be on the decision making of this council? So let's move firstly to the role of the Security Council. And both teams have essentially agreed that the job of the Security Council is to maintain world peace. And that's what the UN says that their job is, so let's just go with that. So the question is, how do they maintain world peace? Because bafflingly, we heard at second that they don't actually think it's about representation, because they've conceded that in fact Britain is not going to do a very good job of representing Africa. China is not going to do a very good job of representing South America. And we've told you we think the best people to represent these regions are countries from those regions. And that is why, no thank you, we've proposed the addition of these 5 extra states. So the first thing I want to ask is, why does representation matter? Well, ladies and gentlemen, you go to the people of Sierra Leone and the people of Liberia who are embroiled in civil wars and tell them that Africa doesn't matter because they're not one of the 5 world superpowers and that their security doesn't matter. You tell the people whose societies are being wrecked and debilitated by things like aid and poverty, which that team doesn't think is a priority, and you tell them that their security doesn't matter because they're not one of the 5 world superpowers. No, thank you. We say that countries like Britain, countries like the US, are the countries which have the most secure nations for their people. And it is their job to help the people who are actually suffering things like war in places like Africa, in places like Asia. And that is why it is absolutely vital that we get representation from those regions to decide the best way, no thank you, of going about that. So we can see quite clearly that there's no reason why, and in fact there's a reason to not just concentrate the power in the 5 main nations that we already see. So So let's look at what we proposed and why it's a good proposal. So firstly, we talked about Japan. We told you that they are one of the biggest providers of peacekeepers. We talked about India, told you they have one of the biggest economies and the third largest army in the world. We told you that Egypt has been a key deal breaker in Middle Eastern negotiations and that the Arab world supports them. And we've told you that Brazil is a country in that region which is the biggest, the most powerful, and is facilitating cooperation with other countries. So what do we hear, no thank you, from the opposition on this? Well, they told us that firstly, these countries aren't military powerful, therefore they shouldn't be there. But we've already told you India has nuclear weapons and you don't get much more militarily powerful than that. No thank you. But furthermore, we say it's not just about the military, and they never address this point, which Ben brought up, which is that we think it's important to create a paradigm of peaceful means of resolving things, not to say you get the most power by fighting the most wars, but actually to look at countries like Japan, which doesn't actually have a military which goes out and starts wars, but does have huge billion-dollar aid donations, which it makes to the UN to stop wars. We look at a country like India, which may not be as technologically advanced as they think, although, as I've said, they're not, but although given the fact, no thank you, that their IT industry is what's propelling their economy, don't think that's true. We say that India is a country which is actually giving the most peacekeepers to keeping the peace throughout the world. So we think it's not just about having guns to start wars, it's about having money to give aid and peacekeepers to keep the peace. These countries do that, no thank you. So the second thing they said was that, well, actually, we don't think these countries are going to reflect the interests of their region, because they're all out just to help themselves. Firstly, we think it's a kind of funny test to apply to say that the countries on the council, no thank you, should be the countries which are going to care about everyone else, given that they support China and Russia being there. But furthermore, let's apply that test and have a look. And we see that India has been willing to send peacekeepers. Nigeria was willing to keep the civil war in Liberia and in Sierra Leone just in that region and controlling it while the UN stand around doing nothing. We've never had a response to that. And we say that furthermore, it's in the interest of a country in that region to make sure that their neighbours aren't at war, because that causes spillover, that causes refugees, that causes problems for them. So on the question of how we best help the Security Council to fulfil its role, firstly, we see representation is absolutely crucial. Secondly, we've given you the countries that do that, and they've never responded to any of that, accepted.
So why can non-permanent members which are regionally selected not represent their region?
Well, let's move on to that. This brings me nicely to where we get the best decision making. And there are 3 points here. And the first one is that we told you that issues actually get raised when we have more perspectives. And we had this analysis from the opposition that they think having a non-permanent seat means you can do just as much. But let's not kid ourselves here, ladies and gentlemen. The reason we're having this discussion is because the permanent members of the Security Council who have the veto power are just far more powerful and far more important in that council than members who rotate. And that is proved by the fact that people like France were able to, during the Rwandan genocide, stall bringing the issue up and stall negotiations until the permanent members were rotated out, ladies and gentlemen. And furthermore, anything that the permanent members bring up to be discussed can just be vetoed under either model. So the non-permanent members don't solve that problem. So what did we tell you about the issues? We told you firstly, it's not just going to be issues affecting 5 superpowers which come up. We showed you the contrast between the way that the Balkans War was dealt with and the way that the Rwandan genocide was dealt with. We've told you that we need advocacy for regions that currently don't have it. They said we don't need it. We think you do, especially when we see the big security issues facing the world today are in the Middle East and are in Africa. Secondly, we told you that the issues are actually going to be discussed in a better way. Firstly, because you have more perspectives, people who know about the institutional structure of the politics in their region, people who know about the countries, who have relationships with other leaders in that area, and furthermore, people who are actually incentivized to give a good decision. So we saw this in Rwanda. We saw that sending in 4,000 troops wasn't enough to fight 2.4 million people. But did Britain care? Did the US care? No, they didn't, because they were so far away and didn't suffer the consequences. We say that a place like Nigeria would care because they would suffer the consequences. And we had absolutely no response to that. And then finally, this idea of a timely decision, and this is where the veto comes in. So they told us that you get a gridlock because more nations equals more veto. They say either you get no veto, which is bad, or you get lots of veto, which is also bad. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we think they're quite confused. We're not. We think the veto should be used, but only used where it's absolutely necessary. And we say that our model prevents things like Rwanda because of the fact that nations have to come out and be clean and clear with what what they actually stand for, and that means they can't be sissies and shy away from their position. And furthermore, we said that it's just not in the interest of the country to have a gridlock. It happened in the Cold War, and afterwards, Russia and the US both came out and said, never again. And furthermore, better analyse why our model imposes costs on using the veto a lot, because you need long-term cooperation from these countries. We never had a response to that. And furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, we can see quite clearly that we do need representation. Our model provides it, and it provides a better Security Council which can fulfil its role. We are proud to propose.
The speech was 8 minutes and 11 seconds.
Thank you, Ms. English. I would now like to introduce the third opposition speaker.
Under New Zealand's ideas, ladies and gentlemen, about representation, Team England's presence in the final today also represents Wales, Ireland and Scotland. But of course we know... But of course we know, ladies and gentlemen, that isn't true, because we're actually representing ourselves, England. Perhaps the fact that 2.5 of us are Jewish means we're also representing Team Israel here today. But again, that isn't true, because of course nations represent themselves, ladies and gentlemen. They represent themselves. They don't represent regions. They don't represent ideas. They represent their own selfish obsessions, ladies and gentlemen, in the world of international relations. And we say even more than that, the Security Council is not about representation at all. And that's what we've consistently told you today on our side of the House, on the opposition. We've told you why we believe that permanent membership, ladies and gentlemen, is an evil. We've told you why we believe it's an evil that we only tolerate with 5 powers, because those are the 5 powers who giving this power to best cause international peace. And we've told you also, ladies and gentlemen, about the evil of selections, because we've told you that we tolerate necessary evil, but we will not tolerate an unnecessary evil. Now, what I'm going to do today in my speech, ladies and gentlemen, is analyse the 2 main areas of New Zealand's case. I'm going to be looking at, firstly, whether we believe it's necessary to expand the permanent membership, and I'll be dealing once and for all with these ideas about representation. And then I'm going to look, ladies and gentlemen, about the effect this will actually have on the United Nations. Because all of the ideas we've heard about how the UN, through its diversity, will unite, about how by entrenching more personal selfish interests, all of a sudden less personal selfish interests will be pursued. I'll be showing you why none of that will happen, ladies and gentlemen, and all the problems with the United Nations now will be exacerbated when you expand the permanent membership which causes them. So now let's immediately look at the first of these. Is it necessary to expand the permanent membership of the United Nations? Because what we heard today from New Zealand was that the permanent 5 today don't represent the world as it is today, ladies and gentlemen. It's important that it does because it's a global body. And, you know, the fact that we have 3 Western interests on it means that it doesn't represent developing world issues. Well, what we say, ladies and gentlemen, is that, no thank you, that when New Zealand stood up today and told you that the fact that there are 5 nations on the Security Council, 3 of them being Western, and Russia and China, that these nations don't adequately represent other regions of the world. They effectively conceded most of our ideas about the fact that nations, when they come to the United Nations Security Council, they recognise their own interests and don't recognise others' interests, ladies and gentlemen. We say, furthermore, that the nations that they propose to us today are not in the least representative. We've heard that the nations they've put forward will ensure that every continent is adequately represented. Well, we'd like to know how happy Pakistan are about being represented by India, ladies and gentlemen. The fact that India are a nuclear weapon power means you should put Pakistan on, perhaps you should put Iran on, ladies and gentlemen. We say that, saying that Brazil are a really good advocate for South America because they're there, ladies and gentlemen, ignores the fact that Argentina have vociferously opposed Brazil going into that bloc, and the fact that Brazil is politically different, culturally different, speak a completely different language from the entire rest of South America. We say it's simplistic when New Zealand stood up today and told you that Egypt's great, ladies and gentlemen, because they're Arabs, not recognising today, ladies and gentlemen, that the Middle East is not a homogenous bloc. The Middle East doesn't all kind of have its interests immediately embodied in Egypt. No, thank you. And that the perception of the Middle East as Egypt of being kind of too close to Africa undermines the very representation that they're actually seeking today to pursue. We say it's insulting, ladies and gentlemen, when New Zealand stand up and tell us all that because you have an African country in Nigeria on there, the hundreds of different cultural tensions, the hundreds of different ethnic groups, the problems, the civil wars will all be embodied, ladies and gentlemen, in the compassionate nation of Nigeria, who on their own peacekeeping missions rape and pillage where they go, ladies and gentlemen. Everything that they've told you today about representation isn't true, because nations represent themselves, and the nations that they've chosen will only represent themselves, and that's why none of the regions they're meant to be representing actually want those nations to represent them in the first place.
Can you explain for the first time in your case why Nigeria wants to allow a civil war to occur in Sierra Leone and have refugees flood their borders and conflict spread to their own
Okay,
nation?
I'll explain it really simply, ladies and gentlemen. It's a bit like the fact that Russia is really happy to bully Georgia. It's a bit like the fact, ladies and gentlemen, that China is really happy to do not very nice things in its own sphere of influence. Because when you recognise and introduce different interests into the UN Security Council, you merely give those different interests, ladies and gentlemen, an opportunity to prevent interference in their own backyard. And that's what we told you. That's why we told you that the P5 are different. They didn't actually respond to our ideas about projective power. The reason that we don't like the veto, ladies and gentlemen, but the reason we give it to Russia is so that they can veto resolutions on Georgia, and we don't have a world war over Georgia. And that's what they failed to recognise today, ladies and gentlemen. Because you introduce a nation to the United Nations Security Council, it doesn't mean that all of a sudden they're going to compassionately represent other people's interests in that region. They'll represent their own at the expense of world peace, and that's why the veto is a bad thing, and that's why we don't want to empower more countries with the veto. No, thank you. So now let's look at the second issue. What will the effect be on the UN? Because the first thing that we heard, ladies and gentlemen, is that a wider range of issues will be brought to the UN table. And we say, firstly, ladies and gentlemen, that's quite a ridiculous thing to say, because, of course, one of the most discussed issues in that council is actually things that go on in Africa without a permanent African representative. The fact that the General Assembly can actually assign issues to be considered by the Security Council means the world can make sure these issues aren't forgotten about, ladies and gentlemen. Them talking about the need to have poverty and AIDS on the Security Council agenda shows a fundamental lack of understanding of what the Security Council does. It isn't the World Health Organization. It isn't there to solve poverty. We have the General Assembly for that, ladies and gentlemen. It's there to stop war. These issues shouldn't be on the agenda, ladies and gentlemen, because they're mandated by a different body within the same organization. And we say again, ladies and gentlemen, it's simplistic to say that because you have Nigeria on that body, Nigeria will begin to represent the interests of its region. It has entrenched interests, it has biases, it doesn't necessarily like all of its neighbours, and you merely give another opportunity for a veto, which gets in the way of peace and doesn't help pursue it.
For the very first time in your case, could you actually respond to our substantive at first about how new members get new perspectives and new incentives to solve things, as we pointed to in Nigeria?
Okay. Well, what we say, ladies and gentlemen, is that bringing Nigerian interests doesn't bring African interests. We say that African interests are already brought there by voted, rotating, non-permanent members who can raise these issues there, and the General Assembly can get those issues there through General Assembly resolutions. They need to show why Nigeria is better at representing Africa than non-permanent elected African representatives on a rotational basis. And then this bizarre idea about the use of the veto. How because, if one country uses a veto, another country will use a veto, and no one will use a veto. But we say, ladies and gentlemen, if no one's going to use a veto, that isn't something we want to happen, because we've explained why we think the veto is an important thing in certain instances, why we think it's important that Russia use the veto. We say, ladies and gentlemen, under their own logic, if one country at one point uses the veto, under their logic, everyone will use the veto, and you have complete gridlock, which means that their own logic concedes the idea that by introducing more diverse interests, you increase the number of opportunities for veto, which undermines the Security Council's ability to actually achieve the goals that it exists to achieve, ladies and gentlemen. So what have I shown you today? Representation is not needed on the Security Council, and in the name of representation, they undermine the Security Council doing the job that it's actually mandated to do, protect the world. And it's on those grounds that I proudly stand today in opposition.
Speech lasted 8 minutes and 15 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Fox. I will now call on Mr. Ben Woolgard to give the opposition reply speech.
The world has a problem. And it's a problem that's killing thousands of people day on day and year on year. And New Zealand stood up to you today and they proposed a solution. Take the problem, the permanent membership veto on the UN Security Council, and give it out to loads more people, ladies and gentlemen, because clearly that's the answer. What Team England have told you consistently, down the line in our case today, is that permanent membership is a necessary evil. So they had to do two things in this debate. Either they had to show you that it's not evil, that the veto is actually really good, and we're going to show you why that's not true, or they had to show you why it was absolutely fundamentally necessary that Brazil and India and Japan get these seats. And again, we're going to show you why that doesn't stand, because Team New Zealand today have failed in both of their burdens. So let's look at evil. Because what we told you right from the very beginning of our case is that vetoes are harmful because they mean inaction. If you give more countries the veto with more regional special interests, then you get more vetoes and you get more inaction. Because more issues that come before the Security Council directly involve the particular interests of one particular regional power. And that's why there's more inaction. We also say that even if it doesn't lead to an outright veto, it leads to delay. It leads to stalling. And they conceded that, ladies and gentlemen. They were perfectly happy to admit that the reason we failed in Rwanda was because the French used their veto to stall on stuff. And we came to you with this material about shifting the balance of power in certain regions, in Seb's speech. And all they said was, well, this gives us a much broader perspective, ladies and gentlemen. But we don't think that really stands up. Because we've shown you that the Security Council discusses Africa all the time. In fact, Darfur is the principal issue on their agenda. We don't think that just adding these countries actually means that you necessarily get these things represented. Which brings me neatly onto this issue of whether or not it's necessary. Because we never heard any engagement, ladies and gentlemen, with all our analysis on whether P5 absolutely had to be there. Because they had spheres of influence, and if you interfered with those spheres of influence, you might provoke World War III. Now we think that's a pretty serious harm that the opposition have given you, ladies and gentlemen, and we'd have liked to see some engagement with it on prop. They actually conceded that the Security Council wasn't about representation at all. It was about preserving peace, and it was about preserving security. But even if we concede for a moment that representation is really important, what we've told you time after time is that in the same way Mexico isn't represented on the UN Security Council because the USA is there, and North Korea isn't represented because China is there, we say your states in the regions aren't represented by your new countries. Pakistan doesn't get represented by India. That's not how it works. Nations pursue their own self-interest. And we think it's frankly offensive if they want to talk about simplistic logic and the West ignoring African problems to stand up here and say, one African can speak for them all. We say that that simply is not true. And then, ladies and gentlemen, they said, well, look, actually, these problems are in these countries' backyards. Says the whole of Africa is not Nigeria's backyard, ladies and gentlemen. The whole of Japan, the whole of Asia is not Japan's backyard. Not all Arabs have the same regional security interests, ladies and gentlemen. So because expanding permanent membership is evil and will therefore kill people day after day through inaction, and because it doesn't need to be done, I beg to oppose.
Speech lasted 4 minutes and 18 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Woolgar. I now call on Mr. Ben Kornfeld to give the proposition reply speech.
Ladies and gentlemen, we told you that we had to prove one thing to you in today's debate, that increasing the membership of the UN Security Council by the members we suggested would help it better carry out its goal of maintaining world peace. And within this, we have seen two areas of clash. Firstly, is representation improved, and is this necessary? And secondly, will our proposal make the Council more effective at passing resolutions, and better resolutions at that? So with this first issue of representation, what we showed you very clearly from first was that the P5 is no longer the most powerful group of nations on the planet. Yes, they are important, but there are many other people who are just as important because they represent real power, like Brazil, like India, like the rest of the group we suggested, and because they also represent regional interests, ladies and gentlemen. And we provided you with analysis as to why each of them was powerful within the notion of maintaining security, certainly more than the UK. And also that through a variety of mechanisms, not only through having the most guns, each of them was important in security because they were able to maintain it through a variety of different ways. And we also showed you why this representation was necessary to produce UN resolutions and UN doctrines which are relevant to the real security issues of the world. We showed you that very clearly. And what did we hear in response? We heard that the P5 are necessary. Well, ladies and gentlemen, they never engaged with our analysis as to why these other nations were equally as powerful as France, equally as powerful as Britain, and equally necessary to include to maintain peace. They also said they only act in their best interest and can't represent other cultures. But they ignored our clear response to this, that it is in their interest to have a stable continent, whether that be Nigeria to have a stable Africa, or Brazil to have a stable South America. Furthermore, it's certainly much more effective than having Brazil represent South America and Africa. It's much more effective than having Britain represent these two nations. It's much more representative. And finally, they didn't engage with our analysis as to how these are still inevitably the most powerful nations in these parts of the world, and they need to be engaged with before decisions are made. And what we showed you was that this is necessary because as a consequence, more viewpoints are heard which can't be ignored in the same way in which non-permanent members can be ignored. And we showed you that this would lead to more effective real-world decisions, decisions which took account to the real situation and more effectively helped world security. And that was why it was necessary, and that's why these nations were necessary. That brings me on to the second issue of will it make the Council more effective? And we heard an assertion from the opposition that more nations equals more vetoes. Firstly, we showed you that isn't true empirically. The US provides 80% of vetoes. It's not a proportional thing. That was never responded to. We also said these nations are more cooperative, and we provided you examples of this. And we also showed you how they can't keep things under the table and the benefits of having things above ground where people can't hide their motives. But furthermore, we brought out a substantive point showing how it changes the incentives for these nations, because they do want things to get done. And when there's a much broader and diverse group with the veto, they need to cooperate in the long run, and we provide an incentive for them to do so. And in response, the opposition looked at it in black and white, as in everybody vetoes or no vetoes. But they never showed us how the incentive that we showed you which exists does not exist. Now this incentive makes the use of the veto only occur when it is really necessary. And because representation is necessary, and because we make the Security Council more effective, the motion stands.
The speech lasted 4 minutes and 8 seconds.
Can we get a round of applause for our debate?